November 7th, 1943. Defensive positions, Cape Torokina, Bougainville. Major Shigeru Iwabuchi pressed his field glasses tighter against his eyes, refusing to believe what he was seeing through the morning mist. The American Marines had been ashore for less than 72 hours, yet the beach behind their forward positions had transformed into something that defied his entire understanding of amphibious warfare. Artillery pieces, dozens of them, no, hundreds. He counted them methodically, the way he had been trained at the Imperial Army Artillery School. 75mm pack howitzers being assembled with mechanical precision, 105mm howitzers already dug in and camouflaged. And those massive tubes being winched off landing craft, those had to be 155mm guns, weapons he had only seen in training manuals describing fortress artillery. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Major Iwabuchi commanded the artillery support for the entire Japanese defensive sector at Cape Torokina. His command consisted of 8 Type 94 75mm mountain guns and 4 Type 9 110 5mm howitzers, 12 guns total to support approximately 5,000 infantry. He had considered this adequate, even generous by Imperial Army standards. The Americans had landed approximately 14,000 Marines in the initial assault. By his count, they had already landed over 100 artillery pieces. The mathematics made no sense. His hands began to tremble as he lowered the binoculars. They have brought more artillery for one division than we have for our entire army group. This is not possible. This cannot be real. But it was real. And what Major Iwabuchi was witnessing at Bougainville represented a revolution in military doctrine that would shatter every assumption the Imperial Japanese Army held about modern warfare. The Americans were not just bringing more guns. They were bringing a fundamentally different philosophy of combat, one where firepower replaced manpower, where industrial capacity substituted for warrior spirit, where mathematics conquered courage. The Japanese army had designed its artillery doctrine around principles established in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 and refined during campaigns in China. The philosophy emphasized mobility, surprise, and economy of force. Artillery was a supporting arm, valuable but subordinate to the infantry's decisive bayonet charge. Weight and ammunition consumption were carefully controlled to maintain operational mobility. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, one of the Imperial Army's most influential staff officers, had written in 1941 that excessive artillery was the mark of armies that lacked fighting spirit. The Americans and British hide behind their guns because they fear close combat, he wrote. The Japanese soldier with his bayonet and his spirit is worth 10 enemy soldiers cowering behind artillery. This doctrine translated into specific force structures. A standard Japanese infantry division in the Pacific included one artillery regiment, typically consisting of 36 to 48 guns, usually a mix of 75mm mountain guns and regimental guns, plus a smaller number of 105mm howitzers for direct support. The entire artillery complement of a 12,000-man Japanese division rarely exceeded 50 pieces. The emphasis was on light, mobile weapons that could be disassembled and carried by pack animals or even soldiers through jungle terrain. The Type 94 75mm mountain gun weighed only 540 kilograms when disassembled into 11 loads. It could be moved anywhere infantry could go. This mobility was prized above all else. Lieutenant Takeo Yamaguchi, who had trained at the artillery school in Chiba, explained the Japanese approach in a manual captured after the war. Artillery exists to support the infantry's decisive assault. It should provide sufficient fire to suppress enemy positions, allowing our infantry to close with the bayonet. Excessive artillery is wasteful, consuming supplies that could better support prolonged operations. The decisive factor in battle is the spirit of the attacking infantry, not the weight of shells fired. Ammunition allocations reflected this philosophy. Japanese artillery units typically carried 50 to 100 rounds per gun, with resupply expected to be difficult and irregular. Fire discipline was strict. Batteries were trained to fire brief, intense concentrations at decisive moments, then displace to avoid counter-battery fire. Sustained bombardments were considered wasteful and tactically unsound. Captain Hideo Nishimura, an artillery battery commander, wrote in his diary in 1942, "We are taught that 10 well-aimed shells are superior to 100 fired without purpose. American artillery doctrine is profligate, wasting ammunition on empty jungle while we conserve our fire for decisive moments." When Major Iwabuchi had deployed to Bougainville, his 12 guns had seemed adequate by every standard he had been taught. The defensive sector stretched approximately 3 kilometers. His artillery could cover the entire front. He had stockpiled 3,000 rounds, enough for sustained defensive operations. His gun crews were skilled, capable of accurate fire with minimal ammunition expenditure. Then the Americans arrived. The United States Marine Corps had developed an entirely different artillery philosophy, forged in the amphibious warfare laboratories of Quantico and tested in the cauldron of Guadalcanal. Where Japanese doctrine emphasized economy, Marine doctrine emphasized overwhelming firepower. Where Japan sought mobility, Marines sought lethality. Where Japanese commanders conserved ammunition, Marine artillery officers expended it freely. A standard Marine division in 1943 included 5 artillery battalions, 4 battalions of 75mm pack howitzers with 12 guns each, 48 guns total, 3 battalions of 105mm howitzers with 12 guns each, 36 guns, plus 1 battalion of 155mm howitzers or guns with 12 pieces, for a total of 96 major caliber artillery pieces organic to the division, not counting attached core artillery, anti-aircraft guns, or naval gunfire support. This represented approximately 12 times the artillery firepower of a comparable Japanese division. But the numerical advantage was only the beginning. The qualitative differences were even more profound. Marine artillery doctrine emphasized centralized control, allowing the concentration of all division artillery on single targets. Fire direction centers could coordinate simultaneous fire from dozens of batteries, delivering devastating concentrations that Japanese commanders had never imagined possible. Colonel Robert Hoggaboom, commanding the 12th Marines, the artillery regiment of the 1st Marine Division, explained the philosophy. "We don't seek fair fights. We seek overwhelming superiority at the decisive point. If I can bring 50 guns to bear on a Japanese position defended by 500 men, I will destroy that position with artillery fire alone, preserving Marine infantry for exploitation rather than frontal assault." The ammunition expenditure figures reflected this philosophy. Where Japanese batteries operated with 50 to 100 rounds per gun as standard load, Marine artillery landed with 500 to 1,000 rounds per gun immediately available, with massive stockpiles building continuously as supplies flowed ashore. A Marine division could expend in a single day more artillery ammunition than a Japanese division might fire in a month. At Bougainville, Major Iwabuchi was about to receive a devastating education in what this difference meant in practical terms. November 10, 1943. The expected Japanese counterattack came at dawn. Colonel Iwamatsuda had planned the assault meticulously, according to doctrine. His 23rd Infantry Regiment, approximately 3,000 men, would assault the American perimeter at its weakest point, where jungle extended nearly to the Marine positions. Major Iwabuchi's artillery would provide 15 minutes of preparatory fire, then shift to interdict American reinforcement routes while the infantry closed with the bayonet. The attack began according to plan. At 0530 hours, Iwabuchi's 12 guns opened fire, concentrating on the American positions. His gunners performed magnificently, firing 120 rounds in 15 minutes, expending 10% of his entire ammunition stockpile in this decisive moment. The Japanese infantry emerged from the jungle at 0545, advancing in successive waves with bayonets fixed, flags flying, officers leading with drawn swords. The charge embodied everything Japanese military doctrine held sacred: courage, discipline, and warrior spirit. The American response shattered this vision like crystal striking stone. The Marine forward observers had been tracking Japanese preparations all night. When the assault began, they had exact coordinates for every Japanese position. Fire direction centers processed target data with mechanical efficiency. Fire missions went out simultaneously to every artillery battery in range. At 05:46, exactly 1 minute after the Japanese infantry emerged from cover, the American artillery responded. Not 12 guns, not 24. 72 guns fired simultaneously on the Japanese assault formations. Every 75mm pack howitzer, every 105mm howitzer, and 8 155mm guns in the division artillery concentrated their fire on a front approximately 500 meters wide. Colonel Matsuda's assault dissolved in minutes. The artillery concentration was beyond anything in Japanese military experience. Shells fell so densely that the jungle canopy itself seemed to explode. Trees burst into splinters. The earth erupted in continuous fountains of mud and shrapnel. The sound was not individual explosions, but a continuous roar that made thought impossible. Captain Tadashi Suzuki, commanding the 2nd Company, survived because he had been in a slight depression when the barrage began. His after-action report, recovered from his body 3 days later, described what he witnessed. The forest vanished. My company vanished. I saw Lieutenant Nakamura leading the 3rd Platoon, then the ground where he stood erupted. When the smoke cleared, there was only a crater. This happened everywhere simultaneously. Men simply ceased to exist. This was not battle. This was industrial murder. The American artillery fired for 12 minutes. In that time, 72 guns expended approximately 2,000 rounds. The Japanese assault, which had taken weeks to plan and prepare, was destroyed before it advanced 100 meters. Of 3,000 Japanese soldiers committed to the attack, fewer than 800 survived to retreat to their starting positions. Not one Japanese soldier reached the American lines. Major Iwabuchi watched the destruction from his observation post. His own guns had fallen silent after their initial barrage, conserving ammunition according to doctrine. The Americans were still firing. Their guns had not stopped. The ammunition they were expending in minutes exceeded what he had available for weeks of combat. He wrote in his notebook the entry discovered after his death at Bougainville in December. We are fighting an enemy that does not understand economy of force because they do not need to. They have infinite shells, infinite replacement guns, infinite everything. How do you fight mathematics? How do you defeat arithmetic? The artillery superiority the Marines demonstrated at Bougainville was not an isolated phenomenon. It reflected systematic American advantages in doctrine, logistics, and industrial capacity that made Japanese artillery doctrine obsolete. The doctrinal advantages began with fire direction. American artillery had pioneered centralized fire control systems that allowed multiple batteries, even multiple battalions, to coordinate their fire with precision. Forward observers, equipped with radios, could call fire missions that would be executed by the nearest available batteries, regardless of unit boundaries. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Japanese artillery, by contrast, operated with decentralized control. Each battery was typically tied to a specific infantry unit. Concentration of fire required lengthy coordination between different commands. Radio communications were limited, with most fire missions transmitted by telephone or even messenger. The result was that Japanese artillery rarely achieved the concentrated firepower that American doctrine made routine. Lieutenant Thomas Loomis, a Marine artillery forward observer, explained the practical effect. I could call a fire mission and have rounds falling in 3 minutes. If I needed more firepower, I just requested it, and the Fire Direction Center would assign every available battery. The Japanese had no equivalent capability. Their artillery fired by battery, maybe by battalion if they had time to coordinate. Ours fired by division. The ammunition supply chain represented an even greater advantage. American logistics had been designed from the beginning to support massive artillery expenditure. Ammunition ships delivered thousands of tons directly to forward areas. Shore parties could unload and distribute ammunition continuously. Supply officers tracked consumption by the hour and ensured batteries never ran short. Captain James Sterrett, ammunition supply officer for the 11th Marines at Tarawa, described the scale. "We landed with over 400,000 rounds of artillery ammunition for the initial assault. That's over 4,000 rounds per gun. We fired about half of it in the first 3 days. Nobody worried about running out because we had ammunition ships standing by with more. The concept of ammunition conservation didn't exist. If artillery could solve a problem, we used artillery. Japanese supply systems could not approach this scale. The Imperial Army logistics emphasized living off the land and minimal supply consumption. An artillery battery in a forward area might receive 1 resupply per week, if that. The idea of continuous ammunition replenishment was incomprehensible. Japanese artillery officers, who examined captured American supply dumps, could not believe the stockpiles they found. Major Kenji Hatano, after examining an abandoned American ammunition dump on New Georgia, wrote in his report, "The Americans have more artillery ammunition in one supply dump than our entire division has fired in the past year. They expend in 1 day what we must conserve for a month. This is not a difference in doctrine. It is a difference in national power." The psychological impact of American artillery superiority exceeded even its tactical effectiveness. Japanese soldiers, trained to rely on their spirit and fighting prowess, discovered that these qualities were irrelevant when shells rained down continuously. The terror of American bombardment became a constant theme in Japanese diaries, letters, and interrogation reports. Private Yoshio Takahashi, captured at Saipan, described his experience. "You cannot imagine what it is like unless you have experienced it. The shells come continuously, not occasionally, continuously. You crouch in your foxhole and the ground shakes. Earth falls on you. The noise makes your ears bleed. Men near you vanish, just vanished, and you cannot do anything. You cannot fight back. You cannot run. You can only wait to die. After 3 days of this, you do not care about the emperor or Japan or honor. You only want the shelling to stop." The sustained artillery bombardments created a form of psychological warfare that Japanese military culture had no answer for. Bushido taught soldiers to face death bravely in combat. It provided no framework for enduring hours or days of helpless terror while artillery turned the earth into hell. The result was a form of combat fatigue that Japanese commanders had rarely encountered before facing American artillery. Dr. Shinji Miyazaki, a Japanese military psychiatrist who studied combat stress cases, noted in his report from 1944, "Soldiers who have endured prolonged American artillery bombardment display symptoms unlike combat fatigue from other causes. They are jumpy at any loud noise, unable to sleep, and increasingly unwilling to remain in defensive positions. Some have begun refusing orders to occupy forward positions, something virtually unheard of in the Imperial Army. The American artillery is destroying not just our soldiers' bodies but their spirits." One particularly devastating aspect of Marine artillery doctrine was the time-on-target technique, where multiple batteries calculated their fire missions so that all shells arrived simultaneously. A Japanese position might be quiet 1 second and literally cease to exist the next, with no warning whatsoever. The psychological impact of this technique was immense, as it eliminated even the brief warning that the sound of incoming shells typically provided. Sergeant Masao Nishimura, interviewed after the war, described a time-on-target strike on his position at Peleliu. "One moment we were waiting in our bunker. The next moment, everything exploded at once. Not one shell, then another, then more. Everything at the same instant. The bunker collapsed. I was buried. When I dug myself out, everyone else in my squad was dead. The Americans had made time itself into a weapon. Even the seconds before death were denied us." The American artillery superiority forced fundamental changes in Japanese defensive tactics. The traditional Japanese defensive doctrine emphasized forward positions, aggressive patrolling, and immediate counterattacks against enemy penetrations. This doctrine had worked reasonably well against Chinese forces with limited artillery. Against American firepower, it was suicidal. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, appointed to defend Iwo Jima in June 1944, had studied American artillery tactics extensively. His defensive plan for Iwo Jima represented a complete repudiation of traditional Japanese doctrine, specifically designed to negate American artillery superiority. Kuribayashi abandoned the beaches, recognizing that any position visible to American forward observers would be destroyed by artillery. He banned banzai charges, understanding that they only created concentrated targets for artillery concentration. Instead, he created an elaborate system of underground positions, tunnels connecting mutually supporting bunkers, all designed to survive artillery bombardment and emerge to fight only when American infantry advanced beyond artillery support. In his tactical directive to his commanders, Kuribayashi wrote, "The Americans will destroy any position they can observe with artillery. Therefore, we must not be visible. We will not contest their landing. We will let them come ashore, let them establish their positions, let them believe they are winning. Only when they advance inland will we fight, and then only from positions that survive their artillery. Every soldier must kill 10 Americans before dying. This is how we negate their advantage in firepower." The Battle of Iwo Jima, February to March 1945, demonstrated both the effectiveness of Kuribayashi's tactics and the terrifying power of American artillery. The Marines fired over 450,000 rounds of artillery ammunition during the battle, approximately 22 tons of explosive for every Japanese defender on the island. This figure did not include naval gunfire or aerial bombardment, only ground artillery. Despite this unprecedented firepower, the battle lasted 36 days instead of the predicted 5, and inflicted 26,000 Marine casualties. Kuribayashi's tactics had proven that artillery could be survived, and its effects minimized through proper defensive engineering. However, the cost was staggering. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 were captured alive. The rest died in their underground positions, killed not by artillery but by systematic cave-clearing operations that took weeks of brutal combat. Lieutenant Toshihiko Ono, one of the few Japanese survivors from Iwo Jima, explained the defensive philosophy after the war. General Kuribayashi understood that we could not defeat American artillery. No one could. But we could survive it if we were willing to live like moles, buried deep underground. The general designed Iwo Jima's defense to turn the Americans' strength against them. Their artillery was useless against our deep bunkers. They had to send infantry into the caves to kill us. This we could fight. The artillery advantage extended beyond direct fire missions. Marine artillery doctrine emphasized the use of artillery for interdiction, harassing fire, and suppression of potential threats. This meant that even areas not currently under attack received regular artillery attention, disrupting Japanese resupply, preventing troop movement, and generally making life miserable for defenders. At Okinawa, April to June 1945, Marine and Army artillery units maintained continuous harassing fire on Japanese positions throughout the campaign. Fire missions were planned to catch Japanese supply movements during darkness, disrupt relief of frontline units, and prevent Japanese troops from resting even in rear areas. The psychological effect was devastating. Captain Koichi Ito, commanding a company in the 62nd Division on Okinawa, wrote in his diary, "The American artillery never stops. Even at night, even in rear areas, shells fall randomly. No one can sleep properly. Men become exhausted, not from combat but from constant fear. We lose more soldiers to artillery than to infantry attacks. How can we fight an enemy that can kill us from positions we cannot even see?" The American artillery superiority also enabled new tactical approaches that would have been impossible with Japanese firepower levels. The Marines developed sophisticated tactics for using artillery to isolate Japanese positions, cutting them off from reinforcement while infantry assaulted from unexpected directions. The corkscrew and blowtorch tactics at Iwo Jima and Okinawa relied heavily on artillery. Infantry would pin Japanese positions from the front, while engineers approached from flanks or rear. Artillery would simultaneously bombard all possible reinforcement routes, preventing Japanese reserves from intervening. Once engineers sealed cave entrances or bunker apertures, The positions were neutralized without requiring infantry to assault prepared defenses directly. Major Yoshitaka Hori, senior staff officer on Iwo Jima, described the effect in his post-war writings. The Americans fought with their artillery the way we fought with our infantry. Their guns were their primary weapon. Their infantry existed to occupy ground that artillery had already cleared. They reversed the relationship we considered natural between artillery and infantry. This was incomprehensible to us. The disparity in artillery capability affected not just tactical engagements but operational planning. Japanese commanders learned that any major operation would be detected and destroyed by American artillery before it could develop. This made offensive action nearly impossible and reduced Japanese forces to essentially static defense. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, commanding the 32nd Army on Okinawa, had planned several major counterattacks during the campaign. Each was detected during preparation phases and destroyed by artillery before achieving anything significant. The May 4, 1945 counterattack, the largest Japanese offensive of the battle, was shattered by Marine and Army artillery fire that destroyed entire battalions before they reached American lines. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, senior staff officer for the 32nd Army, wrote after the battle, "Our offensive operations were stillborn. The Americans could observe our preparations, mass artillery on our assembly areas, and destroy our attacks before they began. Their artillery created an impenetrable barrier that our infantry could not cross. We could only defend passively and die slowly." The artillery superiority also enabled the Americans to minimize their own casualties in ways that Japanese commanders found mystifying. Rather than accepting casualties to take objectives quickly, American commanders would simply bombard resistant positions until organized resistance ceased, then advance against minimal opposition. This approach seemed cowardly to Japanese officers raised on the ideals of Bushido, but it was devastatingly effective. At Peleliu, September to November 1944, American forces took over 6 weeks to secure a small island that planners had expected to fall in 4 days. But they did so by accepting a slower pace of advance in exchange for lower casualties, using artillery to systematically destroy each Japanese position before advancing. Major General Kenjiro Murai, commanding Japanese forces on Peleliu, recognized what was happening. In his final message before the command post was overrun, he wrote, "The Americans fight without honor, but they win. They refuse decisive battle. They refuse to test themselves against our spirit. They simply pour shells onto our positions until we are all dead. This is not warfare as we understand it. This is industrial killing. Spirit cannot defeat mathematics." By late 1944, Japanese tactical manuals were being rewritten to account for American artillery superiority, though the recommendations were often impossible to implement. A captured training manual from November 1944 instructed that all positions must be constructed to survive direct hits from 155mm shells, that units should disperse to minimize vulnerability to concentrated fire, and that major troop movements should only occur during periods of limited visibility. These were sound recommendations, but they required resources and time that Japanese forces rarely possessed. The manual's conclusion was grimly realistic. American artillery superiority cannot be overcome through tactical expedients. It reflects fundamental advantages in national industrial capacity. Our soldiers must accept that they will fight and die under conditions of American firepower supremacy. Superior spirit must compensate for inferior firepower. The artillery advantage also affected Japanese morale in ways that extended beyond immediate combat. Soldiers who survived American artillery bombardments carried psychological scars that affected their combat effectiveness. Units that had experienced concentrated American artillery fire became noticeably less aggressive, more reluctant to leave protected positions, and more likely to surrender when surrounded. Interrogators noted this pattern repeatedly. Sergeant Edward Laughlin, who interrogated Japanese prisoners at Okinawa, reported, "The prisoners who had been subjected to prolonged artillery bombardment were noticeably different from those captured early in battles. They seemed almost grateful to be captured, relieved to escape the shelling. Many said they had stopped believing they could survive. The artillery had destroyed their will to resist more effectively than any propaganda. The industrial capacity that enabled American artillery superiority was itself a weapon that demoralized Japanese forces. Prisoners who were shown American supply dumps, ammunition stockpiles, and logistics operations often became convinced that Japan could not possibly win the war. The sheer scale of American material superiority made continued resistance seem futile. Lieutenant Sadao Igarashi, captured at Guam in August 1944, wrote in his diary after being shown an American artillery ammunition dump, "They have built mountains of shells." Mountains. I have seen stockpiles that contain more ammunition than all of Japan fired in the entire China campaign. How can we defeat a nation with such resources? How can spirit overcome this? The naval gunfire support that complemented marine artillery made the disparity even more pronounced. A single American battleship could deliver the equivalent firepower of an entire Japanese division's artillery in a single salvo. Cruisers and destroyers added additional layers of fire support that Japanese forces had no means to counter. At Iwo Jima, the pre-landing bombardment included 3 days of naval gunfire and aerial bombardment that delivered over 20,000 tons of explosives onto the 8-square-mile island. This was more explosive power than Japan had fired from all artillery in the entire Pacific War to that date, and this was merely preparatory fire, before the ground artillery even came ashore. Captain Tsunezo Wachi, watching this bombardment from Mount Suribachi, wrote in his diary, "The Americans are trying to simply erase the island. They have shells to waste on empty jungle, on positions that no longer exist, on ground already blasted 20 times over." This is not military necessity. This is the demonstration of absolute power. They are showing us that they can afford to waste more ammunition than we can afford to fire. The psychological impact of this demonstration of power should not be underestimated. Japanese soldiers who witnessed American artillery superiority understood that they were facing an enemy that could not be defeated through traditional means. This realization, spreading through Japanese forces after every major engagement, contributed to the collapse of morale in the final year of the war. The Battle of Okinawa demonstrated the fully mature American artillery doctrine. The 10th Army, which included both Marine and Army divisions, deployed over 600 major-caliber artillery pieces for the campaign. These guns fired over 2 million rounds during the 82-day battle, approximately 26,000 rounds per gun, or over 300 rounds per gun per day of the campaign. This rate of fire, sustained for nearly 3 months, would have been incomprehensible to Japanese artillery officers. It exceeded Japan's total artillery ammunition production for the entire Pacific theater in some months. The Americans were expending more artillery ammunition on a single island than Japan could manufacture for all its forces combined. Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, Chief of Staff of the 32nd Army on Okinawa, wrote in his final assessment before committing suicide on June 23, 1945, "We have fought bravely, but bravery cannot silence artillery. Our soldiers have shown supreme courage, but courage does not stop shells. The Americans have proven that industrial capacity is the ultimate military virtue in modern warfare. They have more of everything, and they use it all. We cannot win a war of material. We can only make them pay for their victory in blood. Even this we have failed to do adequately." In the final analysis, American artillery superiority, particularly the 12-to-1 advantage in guns per division and the even greater advantage in ammunition expenditure, represented a revolution in warfare that Japanese military doctrine had no answer for. It transformed the Pacific War from a contest between opposing armies into a systematic destruction of Japanese forces through overwhelming firepower. The terror this inspired in Japanese forces was well-founded. They were fighting an enemy that could afford to expend more ammunition finding them than they could fire in their defense. An enemy that treated artillery bombardment as the solution to every tactical problem. An enemy whose supply ships carried more artillery ammunition than Japanese factories could produce in months. Private First Class Hironori Yoshida, who surrendered on Okinawa in June 1945, perhaps summarized the Japanese perspective most concisely when interrogators asked him about American artillery. He replied, "You ask what we thought of your artillery. We did not think. We prayed. We prayed that the shells would miss. We prayed that our positions would hold. We prayed for death to come quickly. Your artillery made philosophers of us all." What is the purpose of courage when the earth itself explodes? What is the value of training when survival is random chance? What is the meaning of duty when death is mathematical certainty? In that haunting statement, Yoshida revealed something deeper than any tactical assessment or operational critique could express. It was not merely a comment on firepower, it was an existential reflection on the transformation of warfare itself. In his words, artillery was not simply a weapon, it was a force that doomed individuality, experience, belief, and agency. It turned warriors into passive objects in a system far beyond their control, where survival was no longer determined by skill, valor, or fate, but by arithmetic. On Okinawa, this arithmetic was visible in every shattered hill, every cratered valley, and every collapsed bunker. The Americans had perfected the science of gunnery. Naval guns from battleships blasted coastal defenses with shells the size of small cars. Howitzers set back miles inland rained steel on hilltop positions with astonishing precision. Air power joined in, dropping bombs with escalating destructive efficiency. Flame, steel, fragmentation, concussion, all delivered in quantities that turned the very concept of defensive warfare into futility. Japanese soldiers were trained in Bushido code rooted in concepts of honor, courage, and moral purpose. They had studied infantry tactics, camouflage, night infiltration, and bayonet fighting. But none of those skills could stop a 1-ton shell from bursting overhead. No courage could save a squad when the earth itself detonated beneath them. No bayonet drill could teach a man how to fight the concussive force of overpressure flattening his lungs. The Japanese army had prepared for a war of warriors. The Americans had prepared for a war of volumes, weights, and calculations. One side sent men. The other sent physics. On paper, Japanese fortifications on Okinawa were formidable, arguably some of the most elaborate defensive systems of the entire Pacific War. They had tunneled deep into coral ridges, embedded pillboxes into cave mouths, and prepared interlocking fields of fire that could trap U.S. Marines and soldiers in kill zones. But they had made one fatal assumption, that the battle would be about courage, positioning, and maneuver. The Americans had another idea. The battle would be about tonnage. The crucial element was not technological innovation alone, but the industrial and logistical power to apply those technologies relentlessly. When one battery of artillery was insufficient, the Americans added 10. When bombardment for one day did not collapse defensive lines, they bombarded for 10. They logged shell usage not by count, but by weight, hundreds of tons, thousands of tons, tens of thousands of tons. War, for the United States in 1945, had become a supply chain problem, and they had solved it. Consider an American artillery officer on Okinawa. His job was not to fight the Japanese directly. His job was to calculate fuses, ranges, angles, and shell consumption rates. His success was measured in statistics number of steel shells delivered per minute onto a known coordinate. His notebook contained no references to honor, bravery, or patriotic spirit. It contained numbers fast, cold, and unequivocal. His war was not about swords but slide rules. It was a kind of warfare that fundamentally challenged the ancient warrior's identity. Private Yoshida captured it perfectly. Your artillery made philosophers of us all. When a man is isolated from the ability to shape his own fate, he begins to question fate itself. Courage meant nothing in a world where death came not from an opponent you could engage, but from an impersonal equation. Training meant little when the only difference between life and death was whether an explosive shell landed 5 feet to the left or right. Even duty, arguably, the most resilient military concept, crumbled under the weight of those impersonal forces. What is duty, after all, when fulfilling it, does not alter the outcome? What meaning is there in holding a position when the enemy does not come with rifles and bayonets, but with detonations powerful enough to erase the position itself? Artillery had inverted the meaning of battle. The Americans had discovered that the path to victory in the Pacific did not require defeating Japanese spirit, tactics, or courage. It required only delivering sufficient explosives onto Japanese positions to make those qualities irrelevant. This was warfare, at its most chillingly rational, the conversion of human combat into pure calculation. Each American shell fired across Okinawa represented the product of factories in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Ohio, rail yards in Kansas and Colorado, shipyards in California, and logistical planning at the Pentagon. This industrial organism extended across an entire nation: men, women, machines, assembly lines, engineers, transport operators, all working to project calculated violence across the Pacific. Japanese soldiers, meanwhile, were left to wonder what had become of the warrior spirit their officers preached. They had been promised that spirit could overcome material shortages, a romantic notion rooted in centuries of tradition. But spirit cannot defuse a 155mm shell. Spirit cannot rebuild steel-reinforced bunkers pulverized by naval bombardment. Spirit cannot reassemble a body torn apart by shrapnel. On Okinawa, every shell that landed counted as an argument against spiritual warfare and in favor of industrial warfare. And yet, for all its arithmetic elegance, this form of war was psychologically brutal, not only to those on the plateau, receiving end, but also to those delivering it. Many American artillerymen never saw a Japanese soldier. They operated behind the lines, far from danger, adjusting angles and shell types based on coordinates. Some struggled with a sense of detachment, unnerved by the fact that they never saw the faces of men they killed. Others felt pride not for the destruction, but for the precision, the efficiency, the effectiveness of their craft. They believed that minimizing friendly casualties justified maximizing enemy destruction. The Japanese understood this logic perhaps too late. Their military doctrine prized close combat, night infiltration, bayonet charges, suicide attacks. They believed the human mind was the ultimate weapon. But they encountered a form of warfare in which the human mind barely participated. They entered the battle prepared to die bravely. They instead died anonymously. They expected to fight warriors. They instead fought calculations. Private Yoshida was not alone in philosophizing under bombardment. Interrogation transcripts from other Japanese prisoners of war reveal similar existential reflections. One soldier from the 32nd Army stated, "We could accept death in battle. But this was not battle. This was erasure." Another wrote hauntingly in a diary found in a shattered cave, "We do not die as soldiers. We disappear." The Americans, over the course of the Pacific Campaign, learned a hard truth. Defeating the Japanese meant not out-fighting them, but out-supplying them. The decisive battles, Midway, Guadalcanal, Saipan, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, were not merely military victories, they were demonstrations of logistical supremacy. Each battle was won months before the first shot, in factories and warehouses, on docks and rail lines. This shift raised profound questions not only about war, but about the future of humanity's relationship with technology and violence. When warfare becomes industrial, when death becomes a number, what happens to the concept of heroism? When killing becomes detached from human intent, when it becomes an automated, scheduled process, what happens to morality? When warfare is measured in pounds of explosives delivered rather than battles fought, what happens to history's understanding of courage? Private Yoshida's haunting testimony provides a clue. Artillery made philosophers of the soldiers because philosophy is what remains when action is no longer possible. When a soldier cannot fight, cannot choose, cannot influence, he can only think. In that moment, the war ceased to be about victory or defeat. It became a meditation on meaning itself, meaning of war, meaning of death, meaning of courage, meaning of existence. On Okinawa, and in many battles before and after, one lesson became impossible to ignore. Industrial war is not a test of bravery. It is a test of endurance, mass production, coordination, mathematics, time, and probability. And arithmetic does not care about courage. Not one soldier, not one officer, not one emperor could argue with the numbers. There were simply too many American planes, too many artillery batteries, too many engineers, too many bombs, too many ships, too many factories, too many workers, too many resources. The United States had assembled a war engine large, impersonal, unstoppable. The Japanese warrior culture, for all its nobility, simply had no answer. And so, in a final declaration, the war of warriors gave way to the war of arithmetic. In that war, there were no duels, no magnificent cavalry charges, no grand maneuvers. There were only coordinates, calculated destruction, and the systematic reduction of defensive positions. All that remained to the defenders was the silent hope that the shells would miss, that the arithmetic would choose someone else, that death, even if inevitable, would at least be swift. In that silence, Private Yoshida's words echo, "We prayed that the shells would miss. We prayed that our positions would hold. We prayed for death to come quickly." For in the war of arithmetic, prayer was all the warriors had left. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.